Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for that very, very tepid welcome. I still feel like I am among my own. I don't know that I know many of you personally, but I particularly feel a warm sense of community. I feel like I'm among my own, mostly because of the fact that I'm married to Lisa Wilkinson. I'm told by many of my mates the fact that I'm married to Lisa makes me the president of the Australian men punching well above their weight club. And I am delighted to see so many of my fellow members here today. Rarely have I been in a room with so many ordinary looking men and spectacular looking women. I think after that nice introduction by Jeff, and I want to thank Greg Warren for inviting me to speak today. I think after that introduction, a lot of you would be looking at me thinking, well, he looks like a former footballer, no doubt about that. There is no way on earth, however, that he looks like an author. He looks like a thug. And if you are thinking that, you're not the first to have so thought. About 20 years ago was one of the most humiliating moments of my life. I was invited to the highly prestigious opening of the Rembrandt exhibition at the New South Wales Art Gallery, black tie soiree, only invited because my sister-in-law was the curator who brought it from Holland. And before attending, she'd given me strict instruction, how to wear the black tie properly, how to hold the champagne glass by the stem, and we don't guzzle and throw it down our throat, we sip and we converse and we move on. And I was desperately trying to fit in with the glitterati of the Sydney arts world. Couldn't help but notice the Executive Director General of the New South Wales Art Gallery, Edmund Capelin, kept sneaking glances at me. What kind of a Neanderthal is this who has wandered into the New South Wales Art Gallery by mistake? I managed to work into the conversation. Actually, I have just finished my first book. And he immediately brightened up, congratulated me, and encouraged me to read another one. To talk to you here today, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to talk about. I'll work my way through to a little chat on Kokoda. I'll say this, that I know this is a very strong rugby area with Camden Rams and the Campbelltown Harlequins. Lisa's father was one of the, I think, the founding president of the Campbelltown Harlequins. And I have come out here and spoken at the rugby club and the Campbelltown Harlequins. It'd be easier for me if I had a better rugby resume than I actually do. I'd love to be standing here before you, a la my fourth latest biographical subject, John Eales. And I could regale you with stories about how I played 86 tests for the Wallabies, captained them on 54 occasions, scored 14 tries. Instead of that, you've only got me. Never captained, never scored a try, only played 7 tests. Should have played, by my count, 39. I'd like to think I would have played more, bar for a very bad personality clash I had with one Alan Jones, if you might remember him. I know I don't. An extremely bad personality clash. I maintain I had one, he didn't. And while I thank Jeff for that introduction, I actually never like to say out loud I only played 7 tests. I far prefer to say, and it's the absolute truth, David Campese and I played 108 tests between us. And I'm a great admirer of Campo. I think probably not quite as great an admirer as Campo himself is. The former Wallaby centre Tim Horan once famously said of Campo that he fell in love with himself at an early age and has remained faithful ever since. And as one who's documented the last 30 years of Australian rugby history, I can say with some authority, Campo's the only member of the Wallabies ever to have joined the Mile High Club while sitting alone in first class. And I'm joking, so it's okay. But I do say, in that brief time that I was in the Wallabies, I gloried a little bit, and that was a golden period of Australian rugby. And I think if you look at particularly that back line of the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, you had Nick Farr-Jones at halfback, Michael Liner at 5'8", Tim Horan inside centre, Jason Little at outside centre, and of course David Campese at self-centre. And self-centre just went wherever the self-centre wanted to go. And I mentioned Campo's stats. I think the most famous moment many of you will remember was, I think, 6 minutes to go before the end of the World Cup final. In 1991, Australia versus England. There's 75,000 people at Twickenham, 420 million people watching around the world. And this is where Campo added to his famous statistics. I mean, many of you will know the statistics. David Campese, 101 tests, 64 tries, and 1 tackle. And that tackle comes 6 minutes before the end of the World Cup final. Campo brings down the opposing winger, and suddenly the English and the Australian forward packs close in over Campo. And somewhere in that dark netherworld, in that vicious forest of feet, somebody slippers Campo, kicks him right in the head. If you remember the famous footage, Campo shakily rising from the green turf at Twickenham, the red blood meandering down his pale cheek, dripping onto his golden jersey, shaking with fury, saying to Derek Bevan, the Welsh referee, pointing at the English forward pack, one of these bastards has kicked me in the head, you've got to send one of them off. And Nick Farr-Jones, the Wallaby captain, in a moment of wonderful leadership, steps forward and says, "To be fair, Campo, it could have been any one of 29 of us." At which point, Derek Bevan, the Welsh referee, coughs and says, "Actually, Nick, it could have been any one of 30 of us." But my all-time favourite great Australian moment, and somehow or other I sort of gravitate in my writings to what quintessential Australian stuff. And I don't know, there was an English law lord in 1796 who said, "I don't know how to define obscenity, but I know it when I see it." And for me, I feel a bit that about Australianness. It's very difficult to define, but I vibrate when I come across it. And my favourite Australian moment of all occurs 6 minutes after the scene I've just described, because the Wallabies win the match. This wave of euphoria bursts upon Twickenham, sweeps the Wallabies off the field, up the tunnel, into the dressing room, champagne corks flying across the room, advance Australia fair, waltzing Matilda, we are the champions. Everybody's into it with the exception of one man. There in the corner is the president of the Australian Rugby Union, fantastic man by the name of Smokin' Joe French. And he was only known as Smokin' Joe. He was a 75-year-old Queensland sugarcane farmer, known as Smokin' Joe because in his whole adult life, if he was awake, he had a Marlboro in his mouth, with the exception of the World Cup final, when he was placed in the royal box beside the most beautiful woman in the world, Princess Diana. And so there he is, Smokin' Joe French, 75-year-old Queensland sugarcane farmer, fantastic man. I say this with great respect, he had a head like a peanut, because he was so bald and so brown and so wrinkly. And for this whole 2 hours of the match, while everybody else is crying out, "Go Wallabies, go England, try!" there's Smokin' Joe, sitting quietly, his lungs crying out for the tar, the nicotine, the burn at the back of the throat. Finally the Wallabies win, waving before up the tunnel, into the dressing room, champagne corks, waltzing Matilda, advance Australia fair, we are the champions. Everybody's into it, with the exception of one man. There in the corner is Smokin' Joe French with two easing it into his tortured lungs. And the assistant Wallaby coach, Jake Howard, goes up to him and says, "Smokin' Joe, you've just spent 2 hours beside the most beautiful woman in the world. What is Princess Diana like?" And Smokin' Joe immortally replies, "She knows fuck all about rugby." It's been my pleasure since rugby to have made, well, I suppose my foundation stone in journalism is sports journalism. Many of you may read, well, in fact, thank you, Jeff, yeah, the column I do for the Fitz Files for the Sydney Morning Herald. I think if you're going to be a sports journalist, then Australia is a better country than most to be doing it in, so deep and wide is our love of sport. It is not universal, it is, however, a long way ahead of whatever it is that comes second. And I was reminded of this 4 or 5 years ago when I was doing a documentary for the BBC on the 40th anniversary of the moon landing. And that would not have happened without our people at Honeysuckle Creek, Tidbinbilla and Parkes. And so I was doing a story for them, an hour-long program on Australia's involvement in it. And as I was doing it, my sports editor at the Herald recounted to me where he was and what he was doing on the day that Armstrong actually landed. And he was at Bowra, a couple of hours south of Sydney, and furiously fiddling with the knobs on the car radio, trying to pick up this amazing transmission live as it actually happened. All he could pick up at the end of the day was Radio 2KY. Many people, well, we all know the great Sydney and Australian horse racing station. He swears that this is true. He tunes in just in time to hear Armstrong utter those immortal words. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for racing now at Moruya." Of the inspiring sports stories I've covered, I suppose one that stands out to me, when the Olympic Games, I'll tell you what, there's a fantastic sense of community in this room right now, raising money for a terrific cause. But I put it to you, the greatest sense of community that Australia has had, I reckon it was in the lead up to the Olympic Games in 2000, when of course the torch landed at Uluru on the 25th of May, came down the stairs, was handed to Nova Peris-Kneebone, now Senator Kneebone. She ran with it for 500 metres and handed it on and handed it on and handed it on. And for the next 100 days, the Olympic torch went around Australia. And the most wonderful thing were the number of people that took their kids 100 miles, 200 miles, 300 miles to see the torch go by, said to their kids what I said to mine, you said to yours, remember this moment, soak it up, this is the Olympic spirit. And the best of it came down at Ballarat, where sure enough the man who'd been selected to light the community cauldron shuffles along the main street with a torch held as high as he can, and as he goes, there are his 4 kids waving proudly at their dad. And the youngest of those kids was 85 years old. You remember the story? His name was Jack Lockett. He was a 111-year-old World War I veteran, Gallipoli veteran. And he got the OAM in 2001, which he said he thought stood for Oldest Australian Man. And as he's shuffling along the main street of Ballarat, there are his 4 kids waving proudly at their dad. Mabel, 89, Mavis, 87, Jack Jr., 86, and young John, 85. Wave at their dad as he passes. He lights the community cauldron behind, thump, and the Olympic flame goes off. And it's a colleague of mine from the Herald, Jacqueline Magnay, who asked the question on behalf of Australia, how did you, Jack Lockett, get to be the oldest man in Australia? And in his quintessentially Australian response, I hope there's some inspiration for us all, because he looked straight back at her and he said, yeah, well, I've had a lot of worries in my life, but I never bloody worried about them. I love that. Far and away the most worries I've had in my professional life was writing the biography of my former opposition leader, Kim Beazley. I knew so little about my subject after I began that after my first meeting with Kim in Canberra, I flew back to Sydney in what I thought was triumph, sent an email to my editor-in-chief saying I've just agreed to write Kim Beazley's biography, I might be needing some time off. He sent me back an email saying, well done, I'm sure you'll do yourself and the Herald proud. I think you should know, however, that Beazley is spelt with a Z. And so began the 2 most dreadful years of my life, staring at the cracks in the ceiling night after night, thinking, God help me, whatever made me think I could write a political biography. And I always went back to a story the Herald had sent me on in '93 to accompany Mr. Gough Whitlam on a 5-day sojourn to Perth. And I've never forgotten that trip for going through the Ansett Air Terminal at Sydney Airport, such as it then was, Mr. Whitlam leading the way, me with the carry-on luggage behind, both his and mine. And as we go through the metal detectors, Mr. Whitlam must have still had his house keys or his car keys in his pocket, because sure enough, there's a sudden like that. Little guys come in to hover all over him with those metal wand detectors. And Mr. Whitlam, without breaking his stride, turns to them and says, I think you'll find it's my aura. I have long been an admirer. I'm at the table, in fact, of my friend Mark Latham and Walt Secord, as well as Greg Warren. I'm a long been an admirer of Australian politics, not for Liberal, not for Labor, certainly not for One Nation, but I love the approach that we Australians take to our political leadership. It's a fantastic thing in this country that we do not build our leaders to be way, way above us. We don't have an Air Force One and Air Force Two. We don't have the red carpet. We don't have hail to the chief, First Lady or a First Man. We like our leaders to remain of the mob, of the people, and we punish them if ever they get uppity on us. And the best example I can offer from personal experience, in '91, after 6 months of faxes and phone calls, I was finally able to achieve an interview with the Prime Minister of the day, Bob Hawke. All he could spare me was 10 minutes at half-time of a soccer game between Australia and Brazil at Sydney Football Stadium. But sure enough, at half-time, into the corporate box comes Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Sits down, just the 2 of us, and I put the tape recorder on the table, said, Sir, tell me about your greatest sporting moment. Other people milling around, but just the 2 of us. And he sets the scene. There he is on the 3rd fairway of the Royal Canberra Golf Course, and at the moment that he strikes the ball, he knows it's the most beautiful hit he's ever had, sails away towards the green, a little bit to the left, but he's made allowance for the wind. Lands on the green, a little bit to the right, but the spin that he's put upon it, it's just trickling towards the cup for a hole-in-one, the only one in his whole life, the only time a sitting president or prime minister ever got a hole-in-one, and he's just getting to the climactic moment of the fabulous account when suddenly a waitress appears. Nice middle-aged woman, thingamy-bob in the hair, spotless catering thing around, who without so much as a by your leave, excuse me, Prime Minister, excuse me, Mr. Hawke, nothing like that, simply says, how will you have your coffee, Mr. Hawke? Bob Hawke, no eye contact whatsoever, imperiously flicks his left hand. His way of saying, I am the Prime Minister, I'm getting to the climactic moment of a fabulous story about my hole-in-one run, page 1 tomorrow, Sydney Morning Herald. Hang on a moment, come back in a minute or 2, then I'll give you the order. That's not what he said, but that is what that meant. And she, to her eternal Australian credit, didn't hesitate half a second, said, how will you have your coffee, Mr. Hawke? And I cannot do justice to his reply, but it was like his left eyebrow was a fat caterpillar slumbering in the sun that suddenly got 240 volts through it because it shoots up the top of his forehead and he fixes her with his laser beam stare and he starts in on her. Barks at her for about 10 seconds. She flounces off and returns 1 minute later with a beautiful cup of creamy coffee and 2 Tim Tam biscuits for me and nothing for the Prime Minister. And as I sat there sipping my coffee and eating both of my Tim Tams, while he had diddly squat, I thought what a terrific country this is to be in. You wouldn't see that in any other country in the world. Can you imagine the President of the United States, the Queen of England, President of Russia, Emperor of Japan, any of the African dictators, any of the South American presidents and dictators, ever being treated in such a cavalier fashion as that? And yet we do it in this country on a daily basis. And it's in our blood. When I was doing the Beazley book, I devoured every political text I could get my hands on to try to get the Australian political soul into my soul so it would come out my fingers as I was writing. And I came across a story from January of 1946, just after the Second World War was over, when the famous co-founder of the Liberal Party, Sir Barnaby Smythe-Jones, who was the member for Toorak, as his father before him and his grandfather before that, and he'd ordered his breakfast in the Federal Parliamentary House dining room, and the waiter had brought for him the toast, the coffee, the butter, and he's just turning to go when Sir Barnaby says, "Ah, young man, that's insufficient butter. I need more butter with my toast." And the waiter very politely, very properly says, "I'm terribly sorry, Sir Barnaby, but as you know, wartime rationing still applies. There's only one serve of butter per person." At which point the very corpulent Smythe-Jones, the mutton chop whiskers start to bristle, gets very red in the face. There's this volcanic rumbling, and it just burst out of him. "Young man, any idea who I am? Sir Barnaby Smythe-Jones of Toorak in Melbourne. My grandfather was a signatory of Federation. My father was a Minister for the Navy during the First World War. I have had the honour of serving His Majesty the King across 5 cabinet portfolios since 1923 and was the Minister for the Army during the Second World War." And the waiter said, "That's very, very impressive, Sir Barnaby. Do you know who I am?" "No. I'm the man in charge of the butter." In terms of that Second World War, I wandered into strange territory. I suppose after I did the Beazley book, I sort of thought I'd done sport, I'd done politics. What now? I got an opportunity out of the blue to do the biography of Nancy Wake, the most decorated heroine of the Second World War. And it was an extraordinary exercise. Amazing woman. She was born in New Zealand in 1912, came good a few years after that, moved to Australia, ran away from home, landed in London in 31 to study journalism, was posted to Paris in 32 to document the rise of Nazism across Europe for the next 7 years. As soon as the war broke out, joined the French resistance, and she finished the war as a modern-day Joan of Arc, one woman leading 7,000 French men against the Germans and all the rest. And she and I had quite a few blues early on until we both came to the conclusion that she was 10 times the man that I would ever be, which helped calm us both down. And in fact, the actual occasion of the launch was something I'll treasure. It was at the Jewish Museum in Surrey Hills. Up on the stage is the man who's just been announced as our incoming Governor-General. At that stage, Lieutenant General Peter Cosgrove, Commander of the Australian Defence Force. And he's up on stage to launch the book. 300 people there from Legacy, from Red Cross, all of the 4 networks, quite a few politicians, quite a few ambassadors. And he's up there with the medals, and he's got the ceremonial swords, 2 aides-de-camps. I'm over on the left, over there in the corner, 91 years old, Nancy Wake, little old lady with a walking stick, draped across her shoulders. For reasons best known to herself, she had a dead fox, exactly like my mother used to wear, but I haven't seen one since. And Lieutenant General Cosgrove gives one of the great speeches. He says, "We've had many great warriors in this country. I don't think, however, pound for pound, we've ever had the equal of Nancy Wake. I'm honoured to launch her book. I'm honoured to be in her presence. I do launch her book. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Nancy Wake." Everybody looks expectantly at Nancy Wake. Everybody springs to their feet, standing ovation. Is Nancy going to speak? Finally, Nancy stands up, totters over to the podium, smashes the top of the walking stick on top of the podium, bang, bang, to get total silence. Everybody leans forward. She's about to speak. Her entire speech, she said, "I've just got one thing to say. I killed a lot of Germans, and I'm only sorry I didn't kill more. Thank you." That was it. If you ever see the footage, Peter Cosgrove, I like Peter Cosgrove, but he never saw a camera he didn't like. He's leaning in for the cameras, and then he's like a train in an oncoming tunnel. Whoa! Just to get out of the way in time. The success of that book led me to doing Kokoda, and I commend Greg Warren and his 2 companions, Councillor Warren, to walk the Kokoda track to raise the money for Campbelltown Hospital. I must say, it is the hardest thing I have ever done physically. So I played rugby and I did wrestling, I've done all sorts of things. But that one, walking the Kokoda track, and funnily enough, the guys that I did it with, there were 17 of us, we still get together and tell each other war stories about how hard it was and how we helped each other through, always acknowledging that the guys that actually did it, that got to the top of Brigade Hill to find literally 5,000 Japanese, the 144th Brigade coming their way, They're the ones. You will be walking in the footsteps of the greats to do Kokoda. I'm at the moment, I've got my head totally filled with the book I'm writing on Gallipoli, but I treasure that trip that I did with Kokoda. If I can tell you my favourite story from it just very quickly before finishing, the whole glory of that campaign. It was the 39th Battalion, who were at the time the AIF, Australian Second AIF, which my father was a part of. They were at Tobruk, they were at El Alamein, and they had been called back to come from North Africa. And it's an extraordinary, Mark and I have talked about this. John Curtin was the Prime Minister at the time, and the Australians were on the high seas, having beaten, the first time they'd beaten the Germans had ever been beaten, it happened at Tobruk. They're on the high seas coming back to Australia, coming across the Indian Ocean. And at that time, Winston Churchill said, I want those guys, the second AIF, I want them to go up to Burma. Our man, John Curtin, said, well, I want them to come back to Australia to defend Australia. The Japanese are coming very close to us. And Churchill, extraordinary episode, sent the order to say, no, they'll go to Burma, and only 24 hours later informed John Curtin that he'd done it. So John Curtin gets the telegram, the cable at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, wanders the hills of Canberra thinking, what's he going to do? And to the point that all the staff are looking at him saying, putting up signs in cinemas, if you are the Prime Minister, phone home. He comes in at 12 o'clock that night, he sends the cable saying, no, they will come back to Australia to defend. And those are the guys that followed the 39th Battalion in. So the 39th Battalion, they're the militia, they're from around Melbourne. And they're about 1,000 men strong. And one of them I absolutely love. His name's Joe, well, I love them all, but a guy by the name of Joe Dawson. And he was 19 years old, and he gets the call, you've got to get up to Sydney, you're going to get on the Aquitania, and with the rest of the 39th Battalion, go to Port Moresby. Japanese are coming. So he kisses the love of his life, Elaine, behind. She's 19 years old, they've been going steady for 3 years, and she gives to Joe a gold watch that she's been saving up for. And on the back of the gold watch it says, to Joe, for all time, love, Elaine. Puts it on, he feels stronger, he gets to Sydney, where the Finger Wharf now is, all those, not far from Harry's Cafe at Wheels, where all those Swiss restaurants is, there is the Aquitania. So overloaded that when Joe goes down below decks to put his kit down, he looks out the porthole and he sees 3 fish looking in at him. It's that deeply laden. They get to Port Moresby, the Japanese have landed on the 21st of July, they're coming 13,000 soldiers from Japan coming one way, we send up C Company of the 39th, and of which Joe's a part, and in the first action of the whole campaign, this Japanese shell comes over, lands about 20 yards from Joe and explodes, and it blows him back into the jungle. And he's knocked out for about 6 minutes, he comes to, and he does what they did. My head, I've got 1 arm, I've got 2 arms, I've got 1 leg, 2 legs, this is the key one, I've got no blood in my abdomen, I think I'm okay. And then he looks and he can't see his gold watch given to him by Elaine. And he scrabbles around on the jungle floor and he can't find it. Finally his mates get to him, get him out of there. They carry him back, they patch him up, and he goes on with the campaign. And again, he kept going for the next 6 months, an extraordinary campaign by the 39th, backed by the 2nd AIF. My book came out in 2004, and 2 weeks after it came out, Joe is in his house up at Foster, phone rings and he picks it up and it's a very crackly voice, and it's a very old guy. He says, your name Joe Dawson? He says, yeah. You're in the 39th Battalion? Yeah. You're the Joe Dawson in FitzSimons' book? Yeah. He says, well, my name's Bill Carruthers, I was with the 2nd 14th Battalion, I fought on the Kokoda track, and I found a watch. And 2 days later, ding dong, DHL or somebody or other opens it up, and his wife of 67 years, Elaine, opens it up. There is the watch on the back, to Joe for all time, love, Elaine. So as I say, you'll be walking in the footsteps of the greats in the Kokoda campaign. I'll finish on this, that we are met today on the 14th of March, and it's a great day, and I hope that we'll raise lots of money. I want to say there's a date coming up that I think is significant. It's the 22nd of March. I've done a piece for it in the Good Weekend. It will actually be the 70th anniversary of the first time a radio station went out live to a news event as it actually happened. And it was, of course, at the height of the Battle of Britain that the famous BBC One broadcaster Jonathan Smithers, with rising excitement in his voice, says, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we cross live to the Dover airfields, where the Battle of Britain is at its height. Are you there, Godfrey Hornblower?" And if you listen to it on the tape, in the Imperial War Museum in Knightsbridge in London, as I have, it'd raise the hairs on the back of your neck, because there's about 5 seconds, crackle, 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 nothing, 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 and then you hear as clear as a bell, meow, 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 the sounds of the planes taking off and landing. There's Godfrey Hornblower. Can't believe that this new technology, this live transmission, actually works. Yes, I'm here, Jonathan, and I'm here with one of the pilots, originally from Ireland, but flying for Great Britain today. What's it like up there, Seamus O'Flaherty? And the voice of the Irish pilot, Seamus O'Flaherty, crystal clear. His exact words, he said, "Well, it's tough. There were fuckers to the left. There were fuckers to the right. There were 3 fuckers at 2 o'clock and 2 fuckers at 11 o'clock and another fucker behind me." And there's this sudden stunned silence, rather in the manner with which Table 1 has greeted me now. And it goes on the tape for 11 seconds before Godfrey Hornblower can gather himself to say, "I think we should explain to the BBC One audience that the Fokker is a type of German aircraft." Aye, that they are. But these fuckers were Messerschmitts. Thank you and goodbye.